What's up, everybody? Going live. I'm in Gary, Indiana. Today we're going to be talking about the Gary and Western again. I want to talk about the bridges of the Gary and Western. The Gary and Western was a industrial branch that started at Gibson Yard and terminated in Burns Harbor, Indiana. It was a branch that was rented to other railroads. The Gary and Western was a non-operating entity, which means that it only owned the railroad property. It did not own any railroad equipment itself. All right, so um, its maintenance and upkeep was contracted to um, the railroad, which had exclusive rights on the branch, which was Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad. Um, and EJ and E as well, but that was on the eastern side of the branch. Um, it was also called the Doom Park branch. Not well, it's kind of convoluted how that is. It's both known as the Gary and Western and the Doom Park branch, but technically the Doom Park branch operated east of this location, east of Fifth Avenue. All right, and east of Fifth Avenue on the Burns Harbor, that was technically known as the Doom Park branch, but from East Fifth Avenue west to Gibson Yard, it was known as Gary and Western. But on paper, it was just known as the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad, Gary and Western. But Doom Park branch and Gary and Western could be used interchangeably. Anyway, that's another story. I had a Gary and Western documentary that I was working on. I finished like 1/6 of it. Some of you might have seen the clip, which is still up if you know where to look. I'll link it in the description later. But right now, I want to talk about some of the construction techniques used by the Gary, by New York Central, which owned Indiana Harbor Belt. You know, so New York Central had rights on the Gary and Western as well, although they rarely used it. Um, I want to talk about the bridges now. Most of the Gary and Western is elevated, as you see here. All right, west of here at Chase Street. From Chase Street back to Gibson Yard, it is ground level at grade. But from Chase Street on east into Miller, it was all elevated. All right. And the bridges weren't all built at the same time. In fact, there were 22 bridges in total. All right. Along the elevated span of the Gary and Western. Why so many bridges? Well, the reason why there were so many bridges was because when the Gary and Western was first constructed, most of the underpasses that you see like this did not exist. It was all solid embankment. In fact, when Gary was first built, residents complained about them building a Great Wall. They compared it to the Great Wall of China. you know, that was blocking access to the south side of Gary, Indiana. Like all of this was earthen embankment. There was no bridge here, and lots of bridges along the branch that you see every day. When the branch was originally constructed, they did not exist. The underpasses or the subways did not exist. It was all solid embankment. So the residents of the city had to go on campaigns to get some underpasses constructed. And it was like pulling the tusk off a live elephant. All right, the railroads did not want to construct these underpasses, and they didn't want to construct any bridges at all because they didn't want to spend the money. You know, when they designed, well, I'm throwing a lot of information at you guys all at once. It's going to be kind of convoluted, but the story is interesting. When they first built, or when they first was planning the Gary and Western, it was all supposed to be on the ground. There were no bridges. There wasn't anything that was supposed to be elevated, especially on the portion between Fifth Avenue and Gibson Yard. It was not supposed to be elevated. Everything was supposed to be at ground level. But the Gary's first mayor, Thomas Knotts, decided that there were too many railroads on the ground. Ahead of us is the old Wabash Railroad, and behind us was the old Michigan Central. They were both ground level. So it was too many railroads on the ground at the same time. Hold on. How y'all doing? So they decided to elevate the bridges. So, but when they elevated them, they were earthen embankments. They did not construct any bridges, and the residents complained about having access to the south side. The only way that residents could come through to the south side was to go under Broadway, all right, Massachusetts Street. And there was one more, I can't remember off the top of my head, but you know, there was very few access points to where people could be able to get from the north side of Gary to the south side of Gary, all right, because the Gary and Western blocked everything, okay? So anyway, what I'm trying to say is the bridges were all built at different periods of time. They were built in different eras. They were built for different reasons. You know, so all in all, there were 22 bridges built for the Gary and Western. Okay. It's the other side. It's the north side of this particular bridge. Well, I'm on Massachusetts Street in between 8th Avenue and 11th Avenue. And the reason why this bridge was constructed was, number one, it was like a post-war project for soldiers coming home from war. They needed workers. They wanted to provide jobs for soldiers coming home. This bridge was built in 1958. You had the Korean War and all kind of other stuff going on then. And then you also had toll road construction, and they wanted to develop more of the south side of Gary on the Massachusetts Street side. And there were a number of reasons why this area was built. So up until 1958, this was an earthen embankment. You could not come through here. What makes this interesting is, you know, like I said, the Wabash Railroad was up here. They had a stub yard up here, which is a yard where there was one way in, one way out. And the Gary and Western Indiana Harbor Belt served that yard from Lee and see through the trees over there. And then also Michigan Central had a rail yard on the other side back here. I don't believe that Indiana Harbor Belt and Michigan Central interchanged around here, but their infrastructure was close by to one another. Massachusetts Street was opened up in 1958 from 8th Avenue all the way to 11th Avenue, and which resulted in the street that you see today. So the Wabash Yard actually crossed Massachusetts Street up here. Save More grocery store. Let me cross the street. So Save More grocery store didn't exist back then. There were a bunch of other businesses and industries back here. All right. And all of them were served by the railroad Indiana Harbor in this area. So when they built Massachusetts Street through from 8th Avenue to 11th Avenue, the street actually crossed through the yard. All right. And this bridge, what makes this bridge notable to me is the way that it was constructed. It is constructed differently from some of the other bridges along the Gary and Western. So what I mean is by this is built with reinforced concrete. You have reinforced concrete pillars, reinforced concrete embankments, all right? And then the actual bridge structure, the trusses up here, they are not built the same as the trusses that you will see along the older wooden bridges along the branch. And I'll do another video to show you the differences between the bridges and how they were constructed. But you can see at the feet of the trusses up here, all right, they sit on top of the reinforced concrete pillars, okay, and that is holding the weight of the trusses. and allowing for the bridge to stay up. This bridge right here is probably amongst the strongest bridges, along the branch that are still standing. I would not trust the wooden bridges at all. All right. Here we have another example of the feet. You see the feet on each one of those transoms here. You have feet attached to them, and the feet are bolted into the reinforced concrete embankment. And also you have feet along the other segments of the transoms there, and they are bolted into the pillars, creating strength and resilience for the entire bridge structure. So this is 1958 construction. All right. And this is a very sturdy bridge, could probably still hold up the weight of a locomotive and a train. Okay. Back here we have the old Michigan Central Depot, which is this burnt out structure right here. It burnt, I believe it's in 2018. Michigan Central stopped passenger service in 1968. It was in the late 1960s, all right. And the depot was later converted into a paint factory in the 80s. I don't know what it was used for in between the 60s and the 80s, but in the 80s it was a paint factory, and the building was painted a bright blue color. And the paint factory closed, and it fell into dilapidation. So it was abandoned before it burned. It was abandoned for a number of decades. Then, as I said, in 2018, it was set ablaze, or it caught fire somehow, and it burned to the ground. If you check on my other social media, I have pictures. I probably have pictures on my Facebook page of the depot. I came here earlier this year and took a bunch of pictures of that depot. But behind the depot was Michigan Central's rail yard. All right. As I stated, the railroad Michigan Central was there, and it still runs now, but it belongs to CSX. It's called the CSX Porter branch now. But you can look at the state of construction of this bridge, and just by looking at it, you can tell it's a more modern design. It's more practical. It's probably very cheap to build because of the concrete instead of wooden pillars. All right. Even though it's crumbling, you could probably, like I said, hold up the weight of a railroad locomotive and rail cars as they traverse still to this day on this particular bridge. So, just wanted to admire the construction of this bridge and document it. So we're gonna go to another bridge, and we're gonna show the differences between the construction techniques.